everyone. My name is Jaden. I'm part of the Vancouver Startup Week team. And before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're grateful to be virtually gathered on Indigenous land, regardless of where you are joining us from. So I'm grateful to be on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'm privileged to live, work, and play on these lands. And I want to thank you for joining VSW 2021 and welcome you to How Hiring People with Disabilities is Good for Your Business, hosted by BC Partners in Workforce Innovation. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to post them in the Q&A tab on the Whova session. You can also upvote questions to increase their priority. You will also find a few polls created by the session hosts in the Q&A tab next to the Q&A tab. So please take a moment to submit your responses to those while we fix this issue. And I'll pass the mic over to BC Partners in the Workforce Innovation to start the session and hopefully get that PowerPoint slide on the screen very shortly.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My name is Jen Ting. I am a kind of a bit of a moderator as well too, but I'm also a panelist here today. So I am a communications and marketing specialist here, and working with Jamie Miller-Dixon and Jasmine Marchand. I am very happy to be joining you all today. Thank you so much for coming. I'm a person with a disability as well too. My disability has been lifelong as an invisible disability. So I'm a person who has weaved through many different sectors in government and also run my own business as well in the past. So I'm an active volunteer in the community. I have over 15 years of volunteer related experiences related to communications and stakeholder engagement. So I'm very happy to be a Vancouverite as well. I was born and grew up here, and I chase sunsets with a camera, and sometimes I explore neighborhoods with a cup of coffee in hand whenever I have the time. So thank you so much, and I'll pass it off to Jasmine to just to introduce herself as well.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Marchand, and I'm an inclusive workforce consultant with BC Partners in Workforce Innovation. You may hear us say BC WIN, so for short. And I've been with BC WIN for over 2 years. My background is 20 years working as an HR professional, manager, leader, director, and mainly within the tourism and hospitality and food and beverage industry. I previously inclusion, and now as an inclusive workforce consultant, I recruit for employers to make workforce needs and do everything I can to help connect people with diverse abilities to careers with the right fit and the right workplace culture. I thought maybe I would tell you a little bit about how BC WIN, or who we are. We are funded by the Government of Canada's Opportunities Fund for persons with disability. And we are a unique service connecting persons with disabilities to employment. And we work on behalf of the employers. So we partner with different employers. We're going to share some of those different employers that we are currently working with. And we send out any of the opportunities that our employers have with our network, which is over 107 service partners. So, and those people work with all different diverse candidates. Oh, here we are. Jamie's here, which is great.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. I was just telling them a little bit about who we are. So I'll pass it over to you, Jamie.
Great. I'm just trying to share the PowerPoint presentation we have. And what do we have? New share, portion of screen. And that's not working either. How wonderful.
Jamie, if you're able to share the PowerPoint with the green button at the bottom. I think you might be sharing your Zoom at the moment.
Yes, I have activated the share screen feature.
Okay.
And it's not, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see if I can get it back. Mm-hmm. How does everyone like us so far?
If you
well, we still have
the share screen button on the bottom, you'll be able to select which sort of document you're using there, and you can click on the PowerPoint.
Okay. And once again, I'm not able to access that bottom part. There we go, share screen. Basic. Share.
Perfect. Yay.
Yay, we got it.
Excellent. So I'm going to start our slideshow for us. Actually, I'm just going to keep it like this so that we can see some of our notes as we progress as well. Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, and thank you so much for spending some time with us. I understand you met my colleague Gent and Jasmine, and I'm Jamie Miller-Dixon, also an inclusive workforce consultant with BC Partners in Workforce Innovation. So we wanted to share with you a little bit about who we are. We're now in our 7th year, and we're actually a unique recruitment service connecting people with disabilities to employment. And we actually operate more like a recruitment service on behalf of our employer partners. We do that through a network of 107 service partners, primarily in the Lower Mainland, but over on the island and in different parts of the province. These are typically Work BC centers, Community Living BC funded organizations, and most of the Canadian Mental Health Association employment program supports. And we're also funded as a research initiative. So we're researching inclusive employment best practices and sharing that out to government and the business community as well. We are funded through the Government of Canada, the federal government's Opportunities Fund for persons with disabilities. And some of the employers we get to work with, I'll just bring that back over here. These are our active employer partners. So prior to COVID, we were working with employers who were actively recruiting, and they're not recruiting currently. Groups like parq Vancouver, Tocofino, for example, were significantly impacted due to COVID. But these are our active employer partners. So you can see the group there. Really, it's to be an employer partner. These are organizations that are committed to inclusive hiring. They openly welcome diversity. Many have a track record for hiring people with disabilities. I think of organizations like Vancity, who's really led the way in our province, and YVR. They're prepared to adjust their recruitment and retention practices and ultimately support employee career development as well in their organizations. So at this point, we'll turn it back over to Gent.
Thank you so much. Just a friendly reminder, if you haven't completed the polls already, we welcome you to do so now. Our polls are open since you joined. We will move to the first poll question, which is, have you ever thought about hiring a person with a disability? And we have 4 responses so far, and all of them said yes. So that's great. Thank you so much. We still welcome you to complete that poll. The poll's all the way to the end of the presentation. We have one person who has just said no. That's great too. We'll deep dive into that just in a very short moment. So let's continue. Thank you so much. So question for Jasmine today. For employers, what typically gets in the way of hiring?
Sorry, I was just muted, apologize. So what typically gets in the way of hiring people with disabilities is really fear, lack of awareness, training for their managers and leaders on how to create a inclusive workplace. And then employees share with us stories about how, or not knowing where to go or who to partner with. We also hear misconceptions that persons with disabilities are less productive, less educated, skilled. It's expensive to accommodate, and it's difficult to performance manage. And we also even hear sometimes that people are scared to then terminate if it doesn't work out. There's also some myths that we just talked about, but there's also facts that people with disabilities are just as productive as people without disabilities. And actually, many of the candidates that we meet with are educated, if not more. They attending post-secondary education. Many persons with disability don't need adjustments at all. And when they do, often these adjustments are quite minor, definitely less, most often less than $500, if that. And where we'll give you some resources at the end, but where you can go for a resource is a place, is a website called askjan.org, and that gives you some idea on some of the adjustments or the costs of things that might be needed. And we say adjustments, sometimes companies use accommodations, but really what we have found is that that's what gets in the way of hiring people with disabilities, is that people are afraid of making those adjustments or accommodations, and yes, due to cost. But we have seen through the employers that we work with that this isn't a fact, and that you would treat you know the new employees that come in just like you would all of your other employees. You would coach them, you'd mentor them, you'd provide developmental opportunities, and provide feedback on their performance. And so really at the end of the day, there's definitely advantages to hiring people with disabilities and to create an inclusive workplace.
So Jasmine, what does it mean to be an inclusive leader?
So there's a few attributes on the screen for you, but I mean, recognizing and respecting, valuing contributions from diverse employees. It's really about having a workplace or a workforce that reflects the community. In this case, we're talking about people with disabilities or diverse abilities. We've also, when we are talking with our employers, we use diverse abilities or others who face barriers to employment, because there are others out there in terms of poverty. And it involves you as a leader looking at your traditional hiring practices to identify and remove barriers we may not even be aware of that are preventing people or employers to becoming an inclusive business. And I think as a leader, you know, curiosity, I think it's great that we have the participants today, because clearly you guys or the group here is wanting to be inclusive, or is, you know, is thinking about trying to be inclusive. So the curiosity over judgment, valuing everyone's contributions and a diverse culture, treating people fairly, being aware of your unconscious bias, which we all have, and how it impacts your workplace discussions and how to mitigate that. And there's lots of trainings out there. And BC1 has conducted some of those trainings as well, but there's also other resources. But I think at the end of the day, I think treating people fairly, which, you know, of course,
I think we've lost Jasmine's sound.
Okay.
Jen, did we want to move ahead?
Yeah, I think we lost Jasmine a little bit there too for a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, so we'll just move on to the next question. So Jasmine, we'll come back to you. So thank you. So let's have a question for Jamie there. Jamie, what are the business benefits of hiring a person with a disability or diverse abilities?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. There's actually been some really good research on this over the years. Deloitte has done a lot of work in this area as well. So the business, there's better business outcomes, and there's also better human resources outcomes when you look at it in the two ways. So really clear that diverse and inclusive workplaces have, they're twice as likely to meet or exceed their financial targets. They're 6 times more likely to be innovative. And when you think about it, we've got a diverse group of people, there's diversity in thought. diversity and ideas to come up with new products and services and offerings to business. So that innovation piece is key, and 6 times more likely to effectively anticipate change. And then on the employee side, when we look at some human resources data, data is clear: 72% higher staff retention, 86% of individuals had equivalent or better attendance than their peers, and often attendance is a concern that employers may have, and 90% performed equal or better than coworkers. So even productivity levels were quite high. What we saw prior to COVID, we were into some fairly major workforce shortages, and those shortages were reported amongst a group of 500 businesses surveyed again by Deloitte, that 72% found that attracting candidates to their organization was the single greatest challenge to their organization. So a little bit different during COVID, but we will eventually return to some fairly significant workforce shortages. And those shortages were most significant in Atlantic Canada, Ontario, and in BC. So we're not immune from that. We also know that people, we talked to some of the employers who we've connected with, and what they've found is that they actually became better managers to all staff, not just the employees with disabilities. So it had an opportunity to build engagement amongst employees, and data shows that high levels of diversity, high levels of inclusion pays off in a dividend with highest levels of engagement. And I think that's the sweet spot for many organizations these days. Yeah, and Jasmine mentioned it earlier, really the benefits of having a workforce that reflects the communities that we do business in really is something that speaks volumes in communities across BC for sure.
Thank you, Jamie. So with that in mind, let's move on to our second poll question. True or false? Most employees are likely to disclose their disability to their employer. And I'm seeing on the poll here, we've already have some responses. Thank you so much. If you haven't already, you still have time to answer the poll question here. We have the results so far, as in 1 for true and the others for false. So thank you. And let's continue this dialogue about disclosure. And that, I think the majority of the people choose not to disclose, right, Jamie? So why is that? Can you please give us some explanations, possibly?
Yeah, there's many reasons why people would choose not to disclose, particularly with non-visible disabilities, right? There's kind of no choice around that if you're someone who uses a wheelchair for mobility. But, research is telling us that if someone's had a negative encounter or a negative experience in the past with disclosure, they'll be really hesitant to do that again. If you have a workplace culture where there's low levels of trust in the business or even within a team, all it can take is one supervisor or manager to have an impact, right? So that also can impact on whether or not a person would disclose. And then, it might be that the person can actually do the job without any adjustments at all. So they feel like, the individual feels like, well, I just want to fit in and be like my coworkers and not have any special treatment. I can do this job. We had an interesting experience with one of the employees who we had connected. And this individual lives with autism, and he's so-called high functioning. So he could get by in a workplace setting up to a certain point because his behavior would eventually stand out. And so he did not want to disclose to his colleagues or his supervisor. And then there became some performance issues. And that was the point in time where we really had a tough conversation with this individual around, this is to your advantage, because if people, if your supervisor doesn't understand, they don't have that information, they don't understand, and they won't know how to bring out your best at work. So our whole focus was on bringing out best at work and and what would be required to support that. Yeah, so there's, for the most part, in terms of people who have visible disabilities or invisible disabilities, 70% of disabilities are invisible. I think as we emerge from COVID, we're going to see a huge increase to the impacts of mental health in the workplace. So that number will likely go up. And 90% of disabilities are hidden at work. So that's the reality. People just tend not to disclose. We'll talk a little bit about, and we'll share with you some strategies around promoting opportunities in your organization for disclosure in a safe way. But from an organizational standpoint, this is what we're kind of looking at. But Gent, I know you have some experience in this area. Our colleague Gent, I'm not sure you're aware, does have a disability that's not visible. And he's had some experiences around disclosure in his past experiences. Gent, did you want to share that with the group?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jamie. So for me, I can share a bit of my own experience as a job applicant in the past. So for me, previously, finding a job without knowing if an employer is truly inclusive or truly understands the perspective of a person with disability was a really hard road to travel. So I have tried to apply to many different organizations who previously might not have a disclosure statement on a website, or have clearly indicated or transparent with their intentions to hire or welcome people with disabilities. So I had a lot of concern that the hiring manager or the HR rep might not be able to get me as a person with disability because my disability is invisible. And so that might throw a lot of people off in terms of their perceptions of what is and what is not a disability. And so it's so broad and diverse. And so for me, as a person with disability, my pool of opportunities ends up as very limited, if not none. So I can share a small little story that before my previous full-time role, I had spent 6 years seeking an employer that truly understands and welcomes people with disabilities for my career goals. And so I had to work in some environments where I best did not bring up my disability for fear of misunderstandings, cultural differences, not being able to fit in. Sometimes we even questioned about my disability altogether, whether it was real or not. So in that time, I had to default to a lot of volunteering and running some businesses to survive. So this is a very real scenario that's happening, not just to me, but to across the board, that a lot of people simply just cannot say out loud. But I'm very grateful for the opportunities since then. And I'm very excited for the future because of the growing movement towards inclusive hiring. So this is just one experience out of possibly 6 million other Canadians across the country. And so I think this is something that we should be having conversation about. And I'm glad we're having a conversation about it today and how we can bridge the gaps and move forward together. Thank you. So we're still waiting for Jasmine to return. So maybe in that meantime, maybe Jamie, you can cover for Jasmine and explain a little bit, a couple of things, what she has to say. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Jen, thank you for sharing your personal perspective. I know it's not always easy to talk personal experiences, but I really do appreciate your willingness to share that. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So yeah, if you have any questions and answers, fellow attendees, please feel free to put it in the chat for us. If you have a burning question that you want to ask but are too afraid to ask, please put it down there as well. This is your opportunity to do that. We will get to your question and answers towards the end of the session. So while we wait for Jasmine to return, thank you, Jamie, and I'm very happy to be here as well. So for Jamie, what does that mean for employers that are, and what are some of the things that they can do to encourage disclosure for someone like myself?
Yeah, so there's, some of the things that it means for employers. The fact is that we have 1 in 5 Canadians that have a disability, whether it's visible or not. So we already have people in the workforce. If the number is 1 in 5, we often will say you've got 1 in 5 in your workplace. So it is likely that you're already managing people with disabilities. It's also likely that you'll continue to manage people with disabilities throughout your career. And so there's plenty that you can do to create a culture of inclusion where people feel comfortable disclosing, and we'll share that with you in a moment. One of the things that we found most valuable is this little phrase called ATP, and that's ask the person. And we know that there's some legal implications around, you know, while you can't come right out and ask, do you have a disability? There are some things you can ask, and we'll share some strategies with you in a moment that will be helpful around that. You know, some of the things that ICBC has been doing, LEDCOR, Vancity, they provide opportunities, multiple opportunities at different stages up front, like right up front. Everything from having a look at the careers page, what does that welcoming message say about people with disabilities? Everything from the interview questions that are being asked, onboarding processes. So some of the things that have worked really well, right? Because in terms of disclosure, you just may not know. And we know now with the percentage of people with non-visible disabilities versus visible. So providing those opportunities during your application process. What can you ask? Well, some of the things that we found work really well is adding a question to the interview process and early on, because there may be some adjustments that you need to make to that recruitment process as well. So what adjustments can we make for you to do your best? As Jasmine mentioned, we prefer to use the word adjustment over accommodation, because accommodation just seems like it's a lot of work, doesn't it? I mean, but we make adjustments all the time. You know, if somebody needs to start earlier or later or leave early for childcare, for example, we make those adjustments all the time. And so these are the types of questions that we encourage, you know, giving some consideration to in your interview process. And then as a person starts working with you, ask the person, what have you found works best for you to do this job, this type of work in the past? So really encouraging disclosure around that. And in some of the organizations, all of the organizations that we're working with currently, they've adapted their processes to include that. We're seeing even in meetings and Zoom meetings, for example, you know, what are the accessibility needs of participants in the meeting? And usually with our meetings, we have closed captioning on, because that is really useful for our colleagues who may be hard of hearing. So getting into that practice as well, giving some thought to how we're hosting those meetings now in the workplace can be really very impactful, really subtle gesture, but it means a lot to people who need that.
Just want to say that Jasmine has re-entered the chat. Thank you. Thank you. And maybe Jamie and Jasmine, you can probably kind of swap a little bit here in terms of what you want to say. But thank you. I just wanted to continue to ask another question for Jamie and Jasmine here. What other examples can you share of employers who have successfully adapted various stages to their recruitment process?
Jasmine, did you want to go ahead with this since you like the last section, or do you want me to carry on?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm sorry that we do Zoom calls all the time, by the way, and webinars, and I don't know, I got booted out, so I apologize for that. So in terms of recruitment, we've worked with lots of different employers on creating a more inclusive, well, just in terms of recruiting. So first, it's partnering. You can partner with different organizations similar to Work BC, CLBC, our organization. Another great resource is President's Group site. I'm not sure if my colleagues have mentioned that so far. We've also worked with employers on their career sites, on their websites, making sure there's welcoming messaging. We've looked at their interview guides and different assessments, and really asked the question, is that assessment or is that testing necessary for the person to be able to do the job and excel at that job. And so in some cases, the assessments have been removed or not, or we haven't had to, or the employers have made the adjustment to have those employees not take that assessment specifically. We've also worked with the employers to help with their job coaches, working interviews and screening, and then creating a safe opportunity for disclosure. Like Jamie was just mentioning, many people are worried if they do disclose that's going to prevent them from getting the role. So giving them an opportunity during the recruitment process to share what that adjustment is, or what that's needed to do the job well.
Jasmine, can I just add a couple of things here as well?
Yeah.
Jasmine mentioned, adapting testing and interview guidelines. One of the things we've found is those personality assessments, and I'm not sure if you would use them, but they're called psychometric assessments, and they're intended to identify behavior traits in line with what's desired for the positions. Those assessments are very tricky for people who have diverse cognitive abilities or who are neurodiverse, for example, people with autism. The reason is they're structured in such a way that provides, you really have to think about, sometimes people just get stuck in, what's the question asking? Do I strongly agree? Do I just agree? But these are highly detail-oriented people, and they get stuck in that process. It's the same with behavior-based interviews. The way that those questions are structured make it really tricky for people to understand, what's the question really getting at? And so being able to adapt to non-behavior-based questions, just really straightforward. It feels more authentic anyway in those interviews, whether it's a non-behavior-based interview question or doing working interviews where you're doing a show, do, review approach to see if the person can actually perform, mostly task-oriented opportunities. Yes, we wanted to highlight those assessments because if you're using them, you should know in advance they're pretty tricky for many people, and even people who live with anxiety, because it's just not structured in a way that's easy to understand. So a reasonable adjustment would be to bypass that assessment for that individual if you know in advance that the person is neurodiverse or has a challenge with that kind of an environment.
Jamie, I just was looking, and Jen, I was just looking in the question and answer, and they did mention that we have to end by 1:20. And so my thought is that we should share the 4 pillars, Jamie, because I think that's a really great takeaway for any of the participants.
Awesome.
And then maybe some of the resources, because we have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll go quick. One of the things we wanted to share with you as well is that we discovered through working with our employers is it really takes 4 pillars. There's 4 pillars to workforce inclusivity, and it involves commitment, readiness, recruitment, and retention. So commitment is really building that foundation for inclusion. Readiness is preparing to be inclusive, and then adapting recruitment and retention practices to ensure there's full engagement. And many companies will start with either someone says, yep, we're going to do this, and then they jump to recruitment and fail to do that foundation piece, like training, for example, which is why we have put together some resources, a really straightforward practical guide. It's called On Tap Talent, the B2B Inclusive Hiring and Retention Guide. And we've just developed some e-learning around that. And as part of registering for today's session, we're going to make that available to each of you. It's 1 hour in total, 3 modules, all about adapting different stages of the recruitment and retention practice. And then here are some resources that you may find useful. The President's Group has a lot of great resources, all for business, accessibleemployers.ca. Jasmine spoke earlier about Job Accommodation Network, that's askjan.org. And you can reach out to Work BC anywhere in the province and ask for more information if you're interested in being a more inclusive employer of people with diverse abilities. And here's some of our contact details as well. We will put in place, share with you our direct contact if you want to reach out and explore ways we can help you help recruit for your organization. It's free of charge thanks to our funding through the federal government until end of March 2022, and we'll see what happens from there.
So I just want to add one more thing is that we will also put our information within HOVA. I'll transfer that there as well. If you have any questions, feel free to slug it there, and we'll try to our best to get to your questions thereafter. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you.